They say a man who represents himself has a fool for a client. Well, with God as my witness, I am that fool.
What up, Wizards? It's Dev, Mtg. We like it of Magic, and today, one of my favorite kind of deck techs to do. We're going to shed some light on a deck that's been unceremoniously working its way up the ranks and is based around a card that's obviously powerful, but has still been quietly sleeping for over a year now. Let me reintroduce you to Titan's Nest. If you haven't seen this card for a while, so you forgot what it did, don't kick yourself over it. I imagine a lot of people have just straight up forgotten what this thing does, or that it even exists. But to put it simply, it's a 4-mana enchantment that allows you to convert the cards in your graveyard into mana. It seems pretty powerful just on its face. The last time we had a 4-mana enchantment that just gave you free mana, it had to be banned. Remember that? And then the time before that, we had a 4-mana enchantment that gave you free mana. It just ruled the format for a whole year. So obviously, these are pretty powerful when we get them, but no one has been able to break this card until just recently. When I say recently, I mean like really recently. Just in the last couple of weeks, people are starting to catch on to how truly powerful this deck actually is. And just over the past weekend, the deck produced some good results. In the Black Pearl Club events, it went 5-1. In the Inside Esport events, it went 5-2. And then the good results in the Big Magic events, it went 6-0 and 5-1 respectively. Those are very, very good tournament results, all for just one weekend for a deck that very few people know about. So maybe it's time you learned about it, because after over a year, the chickens are finally coming home to roost for Titan's Nest. I'm sorry, I wanted a bird joke in here somewhere because nest, but I'm pretty sure chickens don't actually work because they don't make nests, so I'm going to go ahead and apologize for that pun. Now, of course, just like every other deck with a 4-mana enchantment that makes all the mana and stuff, this isn't the card that actually wins the game. Technically, I mean, it does. You'll see an example game a little bit later where this card makes well over 10 mana in a single game for us. I think it's more important to show you that kind of stuff than just tell you about it. So there will be an example game later on, but first I got to tell you how the deck actually wins games most of the time. Because even though you can't cast X spells or Ugins or whatever with a Titan's Nest, what you can do is cast a Shark Typhoon or an Alrund's Epiphany. Now, these two cards together with Titan's Nest are going to be what most often wins you the game, right? You've got your Shark Typhoon out. You cast your Alrund's Epiphany, usually for just 2 blue mana, because you got a Titan's Nest out, right? That way, you get a 7/7 Shark, 2/1/1 birds, an extra turn, and you've still got a bunch of mana, so you can cast more spells, make more Sharks, and very often, just kill them next turn. But of course, Alrund's Epiphany doesn't have to be part of this equation. It helps us win the game without having to say go. That's a nice little security blanket, but if all you got is a Titan's Nest and a Shark Typhoon, you're still doing pretty well for yourself. Nest gives us all the mana in the world, provided that we have a graveyard, and this deck plays tons and tons of card draw spells, so it's really easy to engineer a turn where you cast 4, 5 plus spells and just create a board full of sharks. And even if your opponent has an extinction event or some other sweeper up their sleeve, it's easy enough to rebuild your board and win the game. But all I've really shown you so far is a bunch of 4 to 7 mana cards. And obviously, those aren't going to come down immediately or anything. So in the early game, we got to do a little strategic planning and curate our graveyard to our liking. I hope you see what I've done there. These are both cards that, just like Titan's Nest, are obviously powerful, but they just don't see a whole lot of play. They're underutilized, but they are perfect for this particular deck, because every card that goes into our graveyard ends up being mana once Titan's Nest is down. Now, when I said the deck had a lot of card draw spells, I wasn't lying to you. I wouldn't do that. We're also playing 4 copies of Thirst for Meaning and 2 copies of Reign of Revelation. Again, pretty powerful cards here that don't see enough play in Standard, but are just absolutely tailor-made for this deck. Thirst for Meaning comes down the turn before Titan's Nest and usually puts 2 cards in your graveyard, unless it puts the 1, but that's going to actually be pretty rare. You want this to put 2 cards in your graveyard a lot of the time, because then it effectively only costs the 1 mana, and it puts 3 cards into your hand. Again, you got to get rid of a couple of them, but drawing 3 is really powerful for 3 mana instant speed. Now, when it comes to Reign of Revelation, this is a little bit more expensive, but again, you see 3 cards off of this, and it effectively creates a mana. But I shouldn't have to tell you that any bug deck is going to play a lot of removal in it. That's, by the way, bug, black, blue, green. I like the name Sultai, I really do, but I'm going to be bug until I'm dug into the ground because I'm dead. Can we go back to calling it bug? I used to really like that. Anyway, we play a lot of removal was my point. So let me show you that. We played 2 copies of Witherbloom Command, 3 copies of Heartless Act, and then a copy of Eliminate to start things off. Now, Heartless Act and Eliminate are just good removal spells, but I guess in this deck, you can cast these in the early turns, and then once you get your Titan's Nest down, they will translate into mana. So cheap removal spells, even more important for this deck than they are for a lot of decks, but Witherbloom Command is the really interesting spell here. One of the only new spells besides Curate this deck actually plays, right? But this is a really cool spell for the deck. It takes out a naked Seasoned Hallowblade that doesn't have a counter on it, or like a Maul the Skyclaves or something, but there's a bunch of other X1s in the format, Edgewall Innkeeper, and so forth and so on, that this can take out, while also milling cards into your yard. Gets you a land back when you want it, and very often you will want it, but it's also worth pointing out, this is one of the few cards in the deck that can create a net positive amount of mana for you, technically, right? It costs 2 mana, but it has the capability of creating 3 mana, and sometimes you'll use it to do that. But we're not quite done with removal spells because we've got a few sweepers in the deck too. We're running 2 copies of Extinction Event and 1 copy of Shadow's Verdict in the main deck with a couple of backup copies of these sweepers in the sideboard. But as far as game 1 goes, we are going to come up against the Yorion decks and other decks that just don't really have a whole lot of reasons to play these in the current environment. So I didn't want to go hog wild on the sleepers, but I do think it's important that we play some of them so we can clear the board against mono red and mono white and so forth. Hello again. I couldn't find a good place to put Mystical Dispute on one of those slides, so I'm just going to talk to you about it here because people are probably going to ask me why not Saw It Coming or Negate or something like that. These are perfectly valid questions. We are a 3-color deck, and I really like Mystical Dispute for that reason. It only costing 1 blue mana, and sometimes it literally only costs 1 blue mana. We don't have to pay the other 2 mana. Or if we have a Titan's Nest out, it can only cost the 1 blue mana, regardless of whether or not we're countering a blue spell. So I like that about it too, but this counters Emergent Ultimatums for a single mana. A lot. We don't have to hold up any mana to be able to do it, and I think that's another point in the card's favor. I just think there's a lot of reasons to play Mystical Dispute in the main. We've got a bunch more counter spells in the sideboard, but when it comes to game 1, I think Mystical Dispute really covers a lot of holes without really demanding too much from us, like a card like Saw It Coming would. But I'll finish off the main deck with a couple of Planeswalkers that we're playing, believe it or not, but there's a couple of really good walkers for this deck specifically. I am playing 1 copy each of Teferi Master of Time and Liliana, or rather Professor Onyx, excuse me. Now, not every build of this deck plays any copies of Teferi Master of Time. Some do, but increasingly I find that people are dropping this card, but I just couldn't resist playing Teferi. Obviously, this fuels your graveyard while also drawing you cards and is kind of a removal spell that will sometimes lead to extra turns. It just seems like a perfect card for this deck to me, and even though we're a little heavy on the 4 drops already, I really don't think that we lose too much by dropping in 1 copy of Teferi, because it just does so many things that the deck wants to do. I just, again, cannot resist the 1 copy, but I apologize for it costing so much. I don't know why it does. Liliana, again, Onyx, rather. I can understand why this costs a lot, right? It's the premier Mythic in Strixhaven, and actually does see play in the Sultai Yorion decks, but sees play in our Sultai deck too, because obviously this is a great way of drawing cards, removing creatures, gaining life back in the late game, or just maybe dealing the last few points of damage to our opponent thanks to the Magecraft. So just so much about this. Sometimes it's only going to cost 2 black mana if we have a Titan's Nest out. We may as well play a copy of Liliana, and honestly a lot of these Titan's Nest decks are moving to 2 copies of Onyx because she really is that good here. But let's take a quick look at the very important mana base in this deck, starting with the 4 copies of Zagoth Triome and the 4 copies of Fabled Passage, maybe the most important land that we run, because this actually creates 2 mana if we have a Titan's Nest out, so keep that in mind. Fabled Passage, really ridiculous card in specifically this deck and most other decks that it's in, but Zagoth Triome just makes all the mana that we need, so that's pretty much a no-brainer. We're also playing some pathways here. 4 copies of Clearwater, it's the blue-black one. 4 copies of Bark Channel, the Simic one. And then 2 copies of Darkboar, the Golgari pathway. We don't quite need green and black as much, but we do need a lot of blue and black. But moving on to lay sideboard here, it's actually a pretty simple affair. We've got some removal against decks we need the removal against. 2 copies of Lash of Malice to take out those dogs and Seasoned Hallowblades, or a Luminarch Aspirant if they have a dog on the table. Lots of reasons that you might want a Lash of Malice, and triggers Magecraft for Professor Onyx, so that's cool. But we've also got an Extinction Event and a Shadow's Verdict from when we have to really crank up the sweeper action against those aggro decks. There's also 2 Negate, 2 Test of Talents, and a Disdainful Stroke. 5 more counters to add to the Mystical Disputes once we get to games 2 and 3. And to finish off the board, there's 3 copies of Duress, along with 2 Gargaroth and 1 Coma here. Now, as far as the Duress, that's fairly simple. We're playing against control and ultimatums and whatnot. These will come in, we'll side out the removal and whatnot. However, Elder Gargaroth and Coma are in there for when the opponent sides out removal against us, because we really don't have a whole lot of main deck creatures here, and Heartless Axe and whatnot don't do a whole lot against Shark Typhoon most of the time. So our opponent will often side out removal. That's when Gargaroth and Coma can come in and catch people flat-footed. Plus, Gargaroth is just a great card to have against a myriad aggro decks in the format right now. If you drop this against Mono White, there's really not a whole lot they can do a lot of the time. Now here are these power rankings. A final score of 68. That's the best score of the season so far, and that's approaching like actual real spice territory. Some of the best decks we've ever done on the channel have scored 68s, and I feel like it's the best score in quite some time, like a season and a half or something. But, you know, aside from speed and offense, we pretty much do everything right. We've got some solid defense in this deck. We've got solid ways of extending the game, and once we do have our combo pieces in place, it's really difficult for the opponent to really do much about our setup, no matter what they've got going on. I have played through many an ultimatum with this deck. I've played through many an Ugin the Spirit Dragon with this deck. But, and by the way, Ziggy's here, even when the deck has to fight through adversity and pilot error to win games, it can do that too. So I'm going to show you a sample game here where we're actually up against a Sultai Yorion deck. And there are a few plays here that I think really make the game. In the early game, we're able to get down Titan's Nest and, just like I was saying a second ago, secure it against a Binding the Old Gods with a Mystical Dispute. That helps us bridge the gap, get into the late game where we can Shark Typhoon, Alrund's Epiphany, and close things out. So you see, even with a couple of hairy plays by yours truly and the opponent really pressing us a couple of times, we were still able to win that game and a ton of other games in practice that we just kind of had no business winning some of the time. So I really hope you get a chance to try this thing out. If you want to grab it in paper, which would really help me out, there's a deck list in the description. It's the first link down there. That'll take you to TCG Player. If you're going to order paper cards to play Paper Magic, they're the cheapest place to get the cards from. So why not try them out? Link in the description if you want to check out the deck list. Aside from that, I know the deck has a fair amount of rares, but if you want to try it on Arena, I think that it's more than worth the experience. If you're sick of Sultai and Rogues and all that stuff, then try something fresh. You know, we do a lot of janky decks here on the channel, and I almost never say, like, you should try this deck to actually ladder with because it's that good and it's going to beat all the best decks and blah, blah. You know, I definitely talk up the decks here on the channel because I don't show you bad decks. I don't like to do that. But in this case, this is definitely a deck that's a cut above a lot of the stuff I've been presenting on the channel in the last season. So I really hope that you get a chance to try it. Aside from that, I also hope you get a chance to do all the YouTube stuff. Like the video, share it around if people still do that. Maybe possibly hit subscribe if people still do that. Even if you're the kind of person that doesn't usually sub to YouTube channels, it would mean a lot to your guy if you would just hit the sub bell and the notifications thing, all the stuff. Just hit subscribe. Just this once. Aside from that, you can check out the Patreon if you really want to help out around here. It's just $1 a month. Link in the description. That'll let you vote on what videos we even do. 2 or 3 times a week, you'll be able to affect the course of YouTube history, all for $1 a month, and it really, really helps the channel out. Aside from that, you can watch me play Magic at Twitch, at twitch.tv/SVMTGdev. Follow me over there. It's free to follow, and boy, do we have the time of our lives. So come by there. We have all the fun you could possibly ever have. And to finish it off here, just wrap it up in a neat little bow, go down there to the sideboard, the comments section. Let me know how you felt about this whole affair here. There are lots of ways to build this deck, and if you go to MTG Melee, go to deck lists, and then other deck lists, you will find quite a few Titan's Nest deck lists, and a lot of them are very, very different. So my build isn't set in stone or anything. This is just the build that I've had the most fun and success with, but there's a lot of different ways to build this thing. Let me know what you'd put in down there in the comments section. I will catch you cats later. I'm Dev from The Place. Thanks for watching, Wizards. Spread love, be kind.